Now we are going to be, for the next hour or so, talking about heresy and war in this panel. You may think that there's not much of a connection between these, the first paper and the second two papers. We've got one paper by Aaron Ostermeyer on the veneration of icons in Byzantine society. We've got a paper by Alex Welker on Leningrad under siege, and a paper by Andrew Hakes on Babi Yar, a closer look at the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. But there are some connections here. I would argue that a common element is definitely conflict. We're going to see plenty of that in this panel. And we're also going to focus on Eastern Europe in this particular panel as well. So without any further ado, Aaron Ostermeyer.
Okay, well, the title of my paper was The Veneration of Icons in Byzantine Society. And the first thing I do want to thank Dr. Levere. I've had some health issues earlier this week, and she went beyond the call of duty to help me prepare for some of the stuff. I would like to say thank you. It is unfortunate that the Byzantine Empire is often considered a forgotten empire among the many empires that existed in the past. The Byzantine Empire not only survived for over a millennium, but also helped preserve classical writings from antiquity with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE. The Byzantine Empire was plagued by a number of controversies during its 1,000-year existence, some religious in nature, some not, but one controversy in particular would make an enormous lasting impact on Byzantine society: iconoclasm. The heresy of iconoclasm has a complex origin within the Byzantine Empire that only becomes more complex as time progresses. The division in the Byzantine socio-political culture is represented by the conflict between iconodules and iconoclasts. And just briefly, if anyone does not know what the Byzantine Empire is, essentially it does contain part of the old Roman Empire. Essentially in the year, this is from 814 CE, you have Turkey, the islands of Crete, Sicily, Sardinia, southern Italy, and we have most of Greece. Now, what are icons? Icons are representations of sacred personage such as Christ and the Virgin, as well as narrative scenes such as the crucifixion of Christ. In its broadest sense, an icon could be considered any representation of a sacred personage, regardless of size or media depiction. In the narrow sense, an icon is most often associated with painted wooden panels. Another common type of icon were those made of ivory, but first, this is an example of a painted wooden icon, and today it is the most abundantly available today of all the icons from the Byzantine Empire. And as I also mentioned, an example of an ivory icon of Saint Demetrios. Icons could also be crafted in a variety of materials, including marble, ceramic, gemstones, and textiles. Heresy, in one of its many definitions, could be said to be a provocative belief that is contrary to established customs, a deviation from the truth, as some people might say. Icons functioned as a device whereby the users believed they had the ability to directly communicate with the sacred figure represented on the icon. The heart of the Byzantine iconoclastic debate centered on the fear that people may misdirect their veneration towards the image rather than the holy figure that is represented on the icon. As we will see soon, iconodules and iconoclasts would essentially accuse each other of being heretics. In fact, even Pope Gregory III, who reigned in Rome during the last decade of the second period of iconoclasm, condemned iconoclasm as heretical. Compared to many other Christian heresies, the Byzantine iconoclastic movement had its origin in imperial policy, and its main supporters were the emperors. Now, iconoclasm can be thought of as icon smashing. Iconoclasm in general refers to the idea of destroying religious images or icons for religious or political motives. It usually is often the result of sectarian violence between competing factions within the same religion. Here I am talking about the two periods of iconoclasm within the Byzantine Empire. The first period lasting from 726 to 787 CE, and the second period lasting from 814 to 842 CE. The Byzantine Empire in the early 8th century was undergoing a period of political and military upheavals. Emperor Leo III overthrew the previous emperor on the throne, as well as the Byzantine armies enduring several defeats to the Arab armies. Emperor Leo III must have seen this as divine disapproval and began to search for an answer for these defeats. eventually coming to the idea of equating venerating icons as adultery, perhaps through his advisors. A plethora of potential reasons exist for Emperor Leo III announcing his edict against icons in 726 CE, including the eruption of the volcanic island of Thera and political motivations, which had the effect of raising imperial authority by getting rid of a roadblock. Before this, actually, people would pray to the icons for good health and everything, but by doing this, he's actually increasing the power of the emperor. This policy of iconoclasm would be carried on to a greater degree by Constantine V and to a lesser extent Leo IV, until this policy was reversed by Empress Irene through the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 CE. The period of 787 to 814 could be thought of as an interim period, if you will. Iconoclasm came back with a vengeance, though, in the year 814 CE at the directive of Emperor Leo V. Possibly one of the possible motives for this was military defeats endured at the hands of Byzantine enemies. This renewed policy of iconoclasm was followed by his successors, Michael II and Theophilus. The death of Theophilus, his wife Theodora was left as regent, who would ultimately restore icons for the second and conclusive in 842 CE through the Seventh Ecumenical Council. The debate surrounding Byzantine iconoclasm is best personified by the group arguments of the iconodules versus the iconoclasts. Those in favor of using religious images were called iconodules or iconophiles, whom were also known as lovers of images. One of the main arguments on the iconodule side was that iconoclasm was not valid because it was enacted both times by a Byzantine emperor rather than a church ecclesiastical council. The Byzantine emperors, iconodules would say, were engaging in Caesar pauperism, or the idea that the emperor was also supreme head of the church too. Iconodules further argued that because Christ was indeed on earth and ate, slept, and preached, these representations should indeed be allowed to show up on religious images. Those who were against the use of religious images were known as iconoclasts. It should be noted, however, that the severity of policies that iconoclast emperors pursued or believed in varied considerably. One of the most important iconoclast arguments surrounding the use of icons was that the veneration of icons was tantamount to idolatry and therefore was against Orthodox belief. Here, the iconoclasts have a point, because icons, right before the iconoclast period, icons were actually began to serve as godparents for children at their baptisms. Iconoclasts also made use of several Bible verses to support their side. Perhaps the most well-known is Exodus 20, verses 3 to 5. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. In essence, idols were seen as false gods, and worshiping one, you are committing adultery, or in other words, heresy. Therefore, the only remedy that could be done to stop this temptation was to remove the offending cause, the icons itself. Here we have a picture of an icon that was destroyed by some iconoclasts with a bunch of holes in it. It's too bad. It's a very beautiful icon too. So, another picture of this is actually iconoclastic art. I do want to give the feeling that iconoclasts were not against all images. A lot of times they would destroy the images, but they would replace it with a cross. They did this a lot on ceilings of churches, on the imperial palace in Constantinople. But there is an example of that. And there's some brief stuff summarizing what I just said. Historians have suggested that women were among the most loyal bloc of supporters of icons. Many historians have suggested a natural sympathy existed between icons and women because the restoration of icons on both occasions were initiated by empresses. Stories were told, in fact, that both Empress Irene and Theodora kept icons within their private living quarters. Two similarities between these empresses exist. Both were at least partially motivated to restore harmony within Byzantine society, and that both also entrusted the task of restoring icons to chosen patriarchs. Historians have suggested that a link between icons and women could be explained by the fact that women had difficulty in accessing as well as participating in religious life. As a result of women being denied important roles within the Orthodox Church, they may well have sought an outlet for their spirituality in a more private setting, which is where icons come in. This is an example of the Cludo Psalter, which from my research is a book that contains artwork from the iconoclastic period. It is from the middle of the 9th century. I think we can all conduce this is Jesus being punctured with the spear. And right over here, this is very interesting. This, I assume this is like a light white liquid, and you have an iconoclast taking it with either like a spear or a stick, an icon, and he's going to dip it in the white solution in the jar to whitewash it. Now, the iconoclastic controversy within the Byzantine Empire had a number of important immediate and long-lasting effects. The most immediate impact was that a significant degree of official control over religious artwork began. The evidence available suggests that this was not meant to restrict artistic freedom, but rather to protect painters from our iconoclast charges. Secondly, coinage returned to the older style introduced by Emperor Justinian II before the advent of iconoclasm. Thirdly, a degree of standardization in the decoration of churches seemed to have taken place. Finally, new types of icons were developed as a result, such as the miniature icon pictured right here. Or, in other words, it's also known as the portable icon. And I believe it is the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus there. In the long term, however, Byzantine iconoclasm influenced future iconoclastic movements as well as important historical figures. One such example of a future iconoclastic movement could be seen in the Soviet Union during the 1930s. Soviet commanders would order their troops to line up and shoot icons in an attempt to combat the influence of the church. These Soviet commanders realized that these icons had a very powerful hold on religious people, and the only way to combat the influence of the church is to get rid of the icons. During the French Revolution, the Commune of Paris decreed that all statues of kings on the Cathedral of Notre Dame were to be destroyed in 1793. This was not due to random mob unrest, but in the same vein as iconoclasm in the Byzantine Empire, enacted through governmental decree. Therefore, the iconoclasm that the Byzantine Empire endured, as well as these later examples, have two ideas in common. The first, the realization that icons have the power to influence people as well as the enactment of iconoclasm comes with at least a degree of political motivation, usually to increase one's power. Byzantine iconoclasm would, in fact, accelerate the existing division between East and West, leading to the Great Schism of 1054. Which right now we're having the current Pope and the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church is actually meeting Cuba soon. I actually found out recently in the news from yesterday. So that'll be really cool. They haven't met for centuries, I believe. So it'll be really cool to see what comes out of that. The division that the Byzantine Empire faced in the socio-political cultural realm during the two periods of iconoclasm was certainly represented by the conflict between iconodules and iconoclasts. Both sides used highly sophisticated arguments to decide the fundamental question of whether the veneration of icons constituted heresy or not. It is therefore unfortunate that our knowledge will always be limited on Byzantine iconoclasm due to the fact that virtually no iconoclast documents have survived, and that did limit the research for this paper. The fortunes of both sides ebbed and flowed during the two periods of Byzantine iconoclasm until the iconodules came out victorious in the second and final restoration of icons in 842 CE. The influence of Byzantine iconoclasm, as I said before, continued to be felt even after the fall of the Byzantine Empire in the artistic realm, as well as influencing future iconoclastic Christian movements and individuals. Thank you very much.
All right. I am Alex Welker, and I will be talking about the Siege of Leningrad in World War II. On June 22nd, 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Despite being warned from a multitude of sources, the Soviets were shocked by the declaration of war. German troops quickly pushed back the Soviet army, furthering the rumor that the German army was unbeatable. On September 8, 1941, the German army had reached as far north as the Soviet city of Leningrad, and they began to lay the groundwork for a drawn-out siege. German and Finnish troops completely surrounded Leningrad from the Baltic Sea in the west to Lake Ladoga in the east. While both German and Finnish troops held the siege, the Finnish troops did not participate much after they fortified themselves on the Russian-Finnish border. Most, if not all, of the siege work was conducted by the Germans, such as the constant aerial and artillery bombardments. The siege lasted from September 1941 until the Soviets were finally able to push the Germans back in January 1944, although the blockade of Leningrad was lifted in January of 1943. The civilian situation in Leningrad was abysmal. The citizens were subjected to constant bombardment, starvation, and some of the coldest winters Leningrad had ever seen. It is believed that up to 2 million civilians died during the siege, most of which were deaths from starvation and exposure. That being said, the survivors successfully resisted the German invasion of their city for almost 900 days before the Red Army was able to rescue them. While there are a multitude of reasons why Leningrad is an important city in Russia, the most important one for the purpose of this paper was that Leningrad was the birthplace of communism, the former capital of Russia, and a major cultural, intellectual, and industrial center in the Soviet Union. In fact, Leningrad before the war accounted for 12% of the total industrial capacity of the Soviet Union. In 1941, when the Germans began invading the Soviet Union, the leaders of Leningrad were initially reluctant to prepare for the eventuality of a possible siege. At first, it made sense. Every report they'd been getting from their officials had been saying that the Soviets were winning every battle and the Germans were being pushed back immediately. This was not true. The Red Army was getting obliterated and was being pushed back further every single day, and the leaders of Leningrad still refused to prepare. It was believed that preparing for the coming Germans would undermine the strength of the Soviet Union in the eyes of the citizens, and that could not be risked. No defensive lines were created until the Germans were virtually on Leningrad's doorsteps, and there was not even an attempt at evacuating citizens until August 10th of 1941. The first attempt was made. It was poorly planned and poorly organized. Thousands of women and children were loaded onto trains and sent west to a nearby vacation spot. This is a map of the siege of Leningrad. Now, you'll notice west is where the Germans are coming from, for general knowledge. And there's no scale on it, but the border with Finland in the north is about 20 miles away from Leningrad. So it was very close quarters the entire time. When they arrived at their safe destination in the west, they were quickly packed back onto the trains and sent right back to Leningrad because it turns out the Germans had already reached that location. Now, this evacuation attempt ended pretty well. Very few people were killed from it, but the next one ended much more poorly. 8 days later, another attempt was made at evacuating citizens, but this time only children were evacuated. The parents were initially reluctant to put their children on the train because they lost faith in the Soviets' ability to evacuate them. They were sent south to the rail lines at Imga, and there's another crossroad to the west of that, Novgorod, that's not on the map. Unfortunately, when they got there, the Germans were already there, and the trains were sent back, but not in time, and they were bombed, and very few trains returned to Leningrad, and even fewer children made it back. Setting the mood for what Leningrad was about to go through for the next 2 years. One form of evacuation that was successful, however, was the evacuation of industry from Leningrad. The Soviets put far more effort into evacuating factories than they ever put into evacuating their citizens. After all, it was easier to train a new factory worker than it was to build a new factory. Entire factories were torn apart and loaded onto trains to be moved into the far east behind the Urals. That being said, a significant portion of Leningrad factories could not be moved, and those that stayed during the siege remained productive, using any and all raw materials available to continue making any goods for the war effort. The citizens who were still alive in the city were conscripted into creating blockades and digging trenches outside of the city. When the Germans had almost reached the city, the defensive plans were being created, and everyone went to overdrive trying to ensure the city would not fall to the Germans. The Red Army was practically thrown at the Germans at every possible opportunity to slow them down even a little bit. The army units suffered high casualties and were depleted quickly. As the number of battle-ready soldiers dwindled, a People's Battalion was organized from the students at the Leningrad universities who had not been drafted. This battalion was barely trained, poorly equipped, and thrown at the Germans immediately. The People's Battalion suffered even higher casualties than that of the Red Army. The ease with which the leaders in Leningrad sacrificed their own people really drives home how little they cared about the safety of their own citizens. Despite the best effort of the city, Leningrad was completely surrounded by the German troops in the south and Finnish troops in the north on September 8, 1941. The German front stretched from the Baltic Sea in the west to Lake Ladoga in the east. As soon as the blockade was set up, the Germans began to subject the city to a near constant barrage of artillery fire along with aerial bombings. The Germans never planned on capturing Leningrad. Their plan was to starve out the inhabitants and burn it to the ground. The first targets of the bombings were any and all food warehouses. Almost every warehouse was destroyed, including one that alone contained over 3,000 tons of food products. After the food stores were destroyed, apartment complexes, industrial buildings, and hospitals were targeted for bombardment. Death from bombing was a constant threat to the people of Leningrad, and it was very common to have to run to the nearest bomb shelter several times during a short trip in the streets. A result of the bombings was the almost complete destruction of all roofs and windows in Leningrad, which greatly reduced the building's ability to keep the elements out of all living spaces, which would prove to be exceptionally deadly in the wintertime. Rationing was very important in the city that under siege. Leningrad was primarily an industrial base as well as cultural and intellectual. All food and almost all the products such as fuel and medicine had to be brought in from the rest of the Soviet Union. Because of Leningrad's reliance on importing food, coupled with the destruction of all their warehouses of excess food, starvation was an immediate and very real threat. Everyone who was an official citizen of Leningrad was given a monthly ration card that determined how much food they got. Unfortunately, there were thousands of unofficial people who were refugees from the territories west of Leningrad. Since they were not official Leningrad citizens, they were not given ration cards, and many of them perished from starvation. There was also a high risk of having your ration card stolen. People would steal ration cards when they did not have one of their own, lost their own, or simply were willing to sacrifice the life of someone else for their own personal gain. If someone lost their ration card, it would not be replaced until the next month's ration card was released, so losing your ration card very often meant death. The amount of food given in each ration was based on how important to the survival of the city you were. Factory workers, soldiers, and the leaders of Leningrad all received the largest rations. All other jobs in the city were assigned smaller amounts until they reached those labeled as dependents. Those were the people who could not or did not work, such as children, the elderly, and a significant proportion of women who stayed home to watch over their families. Rations for the dependents got as low as 125 grams of bread every day in the winter of 41 to 42. The bread itself was essentially sawdust with a tiny amount of grain mixed in just so it could still be called bread, and did very little to satiate any amount of hunger. Those who received the highest rations starved, and those who labeled as dependents died. Over 90% of every citizen death in Leningrad was from starvation. During the time of the strictest rationing from November 1941 to February 1942, almost 100,000 people died of starvation every month. This widespread starvation occurred for multiple reasons. One was that almost every food depot had been destroyed at the beginning of the siege, so all the food the tiny farmsteads outside the city, still under their control, was able to produce was not enough. There was also widespread hoarding of food among the city officials, which drastically worsened the conditions for the rest of the citizens. Some of the officials actually bragged to starving citizens that they were eating better during the siege than they had before the siege. Several sources also suggest there may have been attempts to kill off those people labeled as dependents so there would be more food to go around to the productive members of society. There was one positive thing that the winter brought during the siege: the freezing of Lake Ladoga. This little miracle was called the Road of Life, because as soon as the ice had formed, the Soviets were marking roads along the ice leading from Leningrad to the Soviet mainland on Kubona and areas such as that. A meager amount of supplies was able to be brought in to alleviate some of the starving in Leningrad, and injured soldiers and citizens were able to be evacuated from the city. Although the people of Leningrad saw very little of the food brought in, most of it went to the hoards of the city officials. The road was also called the Road of Death because of how very dangerous a trek across it was. Crevices would form in the ice and would swallow up trucks driving along it. And then driving on the ice by yourself, or even just driving on the ice, made you a huge target to German airplanes flying by, and constant bombing from the planes would weaken the ice until it would break under the weights of the truck. It was very hard to be evacuated across the road. Very few people were able to go on each trip, and only so many trips can be made each day. So if someone wanted to get you across earlier than their assigned time, they would have to bribe their way onto a truck, and then the only bribe accepted was food. Many people would actually starve to death on the way across because they had to pay all their food just to get across. People tried crossing on foot, but it was deemed illegal by the Soviet Union, and anyone caught crossing on the other side would be arrested by the NKVD and sent to work camps in Siberia. That was not the worst part about the trek across on foot, though. The Germans would bomb people crossing the road on foot, but they did a special thing. They dropped mines disguised as food instead that would detonate when handled. Efforts to break the siege were made in August 1942 to no avail. There was a German offensive planned at the same time as the Soviet offensive was planned, so the two offensives ran into each other, and then nothing really happened. They both petered out. No actual progress was made until January 1943, when the Red Army was able to break the blockade by reclaiming the territory immediately west of Lake Ladoga. It's labeled as Schisselberg over there, or Schusselberg. There was about a 10-mile wide area they were able to secure, so they built railroads up to Leningrad, and it greatly alleviated the starvation. 1 year later, in January of 1944, the Soviets began pushing the Germans back to Germany and completely freed Leningrad, ending the 872-day siege. After the siege was lifted, the official Soviet number of civilians who died during the siege was 632,253. Today, the estimates are about 1.5 to 2 million civilians killed during the siege. There are several reasons why the Soviet number is so far off. One is that they lowered the number of all casualties during the war, so it did not look like they had taken such a toll on the Soviet Union. They did not want to seem weak and did not want to make it look like they could not protect their own citizens. There's also the fact that lost people were buried in mass graves, making it very difficult to keep track of them, as well as the thousands of refugees from Western Soviet territories who were not official in Leningrad, so it was hard to keep track of when they died. And there was such mass death in the winter that there were literally bodies strewn across the streets at all times. People got used to the sight of corpses. Now, when people were freezing to death on the streets and family members were slowly starving to death, what gave the survivors the will to survive? The official Soviet stance is that they all possess the superior Soviet will to survive, and it is thanks to their belief in the mother Russia that they survived. It is difficult to believe that the people of Leningrad had any faith remaining in their government by the end of the siege. The entire affair showed them just how little they mattered to Soviet officials. Memoirs of the siege even suggest that there was a little thought of the greater Soviet Union during the struggle to survive. The memoirs state that the reasons people did not give up hope of surviving the siege were far more personal. They wanted to live to see loved ones outside the city. They wanted to keep their memory of their past family members alive. They just simply didn't want the Germans to win. There does not seem to be any one reason why the people never gave up hope. There are just as many reasons why people continue to fight for their survival as many survive the ordeal.
So my presentation's not any more happy than that one was. My presentation is over the massacre at Babi Yar, and I'm also going to take a closer look at the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. So to start out, I'm going to talk about the Holocaust on the Eastern Front, because while a lot of people in the United States know about the Holocaust in Western Europe, they don't know what happened in Eastern Europe. So just to start out, approximately 2 million Jews were killed on the territories of the Soviet Union, and this was before the end of 1942. So just to put that in perspective, in Europe during the entirety of World War II, 6 to 7 million Jews were killed. And while in Western Europe it was industrial means by which they were killed, and by that I mean they were transported by cattle car to death camps where they were killed. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht and the Nazis decided that the Slavs didn't deserve to not see these mass killings, so they just shot people on the street or in ravines or anywhere they found Jews or people they did not like. So a little bit of the reason for this is because while in Western Europe it was still a war of total destruction, it wasn't a war of total extermination. To Hitler, the French and the British were still highly cultured, highly civilized people, so they did not deserve to just perish or be slaves to the Germans. But to Hitler, the Slavs and the Jews in Eastern Europe were little more than at the bottom of the racial hierarchy, so they deserved to be killed and or enslaved. So this explains some of the brutality seen in Eastern Europe that Western European civilians would not see unless they were Jewish. And then the final thing I want to talk about the Eastern Front was that the Wehrmacht was involved in executing Jews, and up until the 1980s and 1990s, people thought that the German army was not involved solely in the killing of Jews. They thought that the Wehrmacht could still be a shining point in the World War II effort, but during this time, historians started to figure out that German soldiers were involved with killing Jews, as seen by this man on the bottom left executing civilians and Jews in Latvia, and then the man on the right is a German soldier executing Jews into a pit in Ukraine. So it was proven in the 1980s and 1990s that the Wehrmacht was not separate from these killings of Jews. So to start off talking about the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, I'm going to talk about killing units and local collaborators. The Einsatzgruppen were German mobile killing units. Some other people call them German mobile masters of death. And these groups were specifically tasked with killing Jews and enemies of the German state, like Communist Party members, which the German state considered all Soviet citizens to be. So they kind of wanted to kill them all. Now, there were 4 Einsatzgruppen units, A, B, C, and D, and all were under the command of the SS and Heinrich Himmler. Now, today I'm going to be talking about Group C because Group C was involved at Babi Yar in the part of Ukraine Babi Yar is at, in Kyiv. Now, a lot of people know about the final solution, but when the Germans initially got on the territory of the Soviet Union, they were still not sure what they were going to do with the Jews. They still thought they might be able to just transport them, just move them, or they thought they might just be able to send them to death camps later on. But their experiences in Poland showed them that they could get local collaborators to kill the Jews for them, or they could just kill the Jews and no one would care because a lot of the local population held predisposed animosity towards the Jewish people. So, just to show an example of these, I'm going to talk about Lithuania and some of the Baltic states. And Lithuania, when the Germans came in, they discovered that if they released prisoners and blamed it on the Jews, the prisoners would go and kill Jews. And one man reminisced that he was walking on the street one day and he saw a released convict in the street beating a Jew with a crowbar to death. And this was not a one-time occurrence. This happened multiple times. And then in the Baltic states, as the NKVD was retreating, which is the Soviet secret police, they would kill the prisoners in the prisons. And they would do this in such an inhumane fashion that when the Germans took the local population to these prisons to say, look what happened to your neighbor, to your family, they would be outraged. And then the Germans would say, oh yeah, and it was the Jews who did that. So by these ways, the Germans were able to distance themselves from killing Jews and also have Jews be killed by local people. My next topic is going to be Ukraine before Babi Yar. Now, Babi Yar happened northwest of Kyiv, and if I could use the mouse on this, I could show you that Kyiv is right here. And I'm going to talk about 2 mass exterminations before Babi Yar, and they happened at Balaya Serkov and Uman. Now, the Soviet Union was invaded by the Germans on June 22nd, 1941, and within weeks, well, actually, right away they were into Ukraine, and within weeks they were beginning their nefarious plans of executing Jews. So, in July of 1941, the Germans were in Balaya Serkov, and they killed 6,000 Jews. They exterminated the entire population, and they did this openly. Amongst the executed, just to show the brutality that the Germans showed, were 100 small children and babies. And just to reiterate, babies as in 1 and 2 year olds. So the Germans got a tip from a local informant that some Jews had hid 100 small children and babies inside of an abandoned building. And the field marshal in Balaya Serkov said, well, and I quote, the action that had begun had to be completed, but in a suitable manner, which basically means you've already killed the rest of the Jews, so kill these children. And the field marshal put the Sonderkommando 4A in charge of killing these Jews. And the Sonderkommando was part of the Einsatzgruppen Group C. But instead of them doing it, the Sonderkommando decided, let's get the Ukrainians to do it. So the Ukrainians took these babies to a pit and they killed them all. And one German officer there said sometimes it would take 4 to 5 shots before they would stop crying. So to further show German brutality on the Eastern Front, I go to Uman, which is located where the mouse is right now, which is south of Balaya Serkov. And there, the Germans killed 6,000 Jews within the first few days of their occupation. So I know this is depressing, but in July of 1941, the Germans killed 39,000 Jews in Ukraine. In August, they killed 62,000 Jews. But to Heinrich Himmler, who is this man located right here, these numbers were not enough, and more Jews had to be killed. And just to let you guys know, Himmler was in charge of the SS, and he also created the Einsatzgruppen. So he was a real lovely guy. Next, I'm going to talk about Kyiv. Kiev fell to the Germans on September 19th of 1941. Stalin had ordered that the city needed to be held at all costs, but Marshal Boudinot could not fulfill this order, and the city fell within the first few days of the German assault on it. At the time the Germans occupied the city, 60 to 70,000 Jews remained. Now, this was better than the 200,000 that were there beforehand, and the reason there were so little Jews compared to pre-war is because A, the Soviets actually successfully evacuated people for once, and B, a lot of the Jewish men decided to enlist in the military. So, when the Germans got to the city, the NKVD, which is the Soviet secret police, decided to blow up some buildings with bombs they had left behind. So, the day after the Germans took the city, the NKVD blew up the German artillery staff's headquarters, and as you can imagine, the Germans were not pleased by this. And then 4 days later, they set off explosives at the Wehrmacht field commander's building, and in response to this, the Germans decided, we need to kill some Jews to show these people to stop blowing buildings up. And just to tell you how bad the second explosion was, it caused some parts of Kyiv to catch on fire. And Anatoly Kuznetsov, who was a resident of Kyiv his whole life, said, and I quote, that the fire was comparable to Moscow's Great Fire of 1812, and to put that in perspective, that fire destroyed 3/4 of Moscow. So the fire was great, and the Germans were angry, and they were looking for blood, and they decided that they were going to kill 50,000 Jews in retaliation to this. But, depressingly, the German high command in Kyiv said, no, all the Jews needed to be killed in retribution for what happened to these buildings. So on September 26th, the German high command decided all Jews need to die, and they decided to use the Ukrainian police that were stationed in Kyiv to put out messages throughout the city that said, on September 29th, the Jews need to meet at this location to be transported and relocated to other places. Now, to ease panic, because this sounds kind of fishy, the Germans, through word of mouth, told Jews throughout the city that they were just going to be relocated. The meeting point was right next to a train station, so for some Jews, this was enough to ease their suspicion that they had. But, I mean, it's not true. To recall what the sign said, Anatoly Kuznetsov remembers the signs as saying, all Jews. On the real sign was an expletive for Jews that was Zhid and Kaik of the city of Kyiv and its environs must appear on the corner of Melnikov and Doktorov streets beside the cemetery at 8 a.m. on September 29th, 1941. They must bring their documents, money, valuables, warm clothing, etc. Jews who fail to obey this order and are found elsewhere will be shot. All who enter the apartments left by Jews and take their property will also be shot. So, to many, this just said to them that they were going to be relocated. I mean, it's next to a train station. They're told to bring warm clothing. I mean, why would the Germans care if they were just going to kill us all? But they were going to kill them all. And first, I'm going to tell you an account of Babi Yar from afar, of what happened in the ravine. Now, Anatoly Kuznetsov, I mentioned him twice. He's a resident of Kyiv his whole life. And in his documentary novel, Babi Yar, a document in the form of a novel, he said that on September 29th, he decided to go with the Jews to the meeting point to see what was going to go on. And he saw Jews showing up early to get on the train and get a good spot. He saw Jews in their warm clothing with their families. But when he was about to go to the meeting spot, he realized that if he went there, he might be sent on the train and sent away. He wanted to go home, so he went home. And when he arrived home, he found his grandpa straining, pointing at the direction of Babi Yar, saying, do you hear that? That's gunfire. And Anatoly said, there's no way. Maybe the Germans set up a gun range. Who knows? But later on, his grandparents said, no, that wasn't a gun range. They were killing the Jews in Babi Yar. So that was an account from afar, and I'm going to tell you an account of up close. And just to give you a number, 33,771 Jews were killed in 2 days in the ravine at Babi Yar. And to the left is a picture of the bodies piling up in the pit, and on the right is a picture of what the Soviet investigators found after the war. So I'm going to give you two accounts of the massacre up close. The first one's from Fritz Hofe, who was a German soldier who drove trucks in Ukraine. Now, Fritz was ordered by his superiors to go to a field beside Babi Yar and collect the valuables of the Jews that they had left behind. But when he got there, what he saw was the Jews going up to the meeting spot with all their valuables with the warm clothing. And then as he walked further, he saw there was a ravine. And in the ravine, the Germans were saying, get down on your face, lay down on the other corpses in rows of 4, rows of 6, and lay there. And he saw a ravine that was 150 meters long, 30 meters wide, and 15 meters deep, where the Germans were walking across these bodies and shooting them all in the back of the head, hoping to save ammo by having one bullet go through the skull into another one. So as you can see, the Germans were very meticulous and they were very premeditated in this killing. And Fritz was horrified by what he saw. So when he went to walk away, he glanced over and he already saw 3 rows of bodies 60 meters long in the ravine. And his account was in the morning of September 29th. It was early on in the day and they had already filled 60 meters of this ravine with dead bodies. And the ravine was 15 meters deep, just to put that in perspective again. My last account from up close is from Dina Pronachiva, and she was actually in the pit. She was a Jewish woman in Kiev. She had married a Russian or Ukrainian man, so her last name did not sound Jewish. So as she was going to this meeting spot with her family, her mother said to her, "You need to get out of here. You have more to think about. You have your kids at home. You can get off as being not Jewish. Just leave." So she told a German guard, "Listen, I came here on accident. I came with my family or with my friends. So I'm not Jewish. I don't belong here." And at first the German believed her. But then a Ukrainian came up and said, "She's a kike. Don't trust her." And then they said, "Get in line. You're going in the pit or in the ravine." So as she lined up to be put in the ravine, she saw a German grab a baby, throw the baby in the pit, and shoot the mother who ran after her. And at this point, she felt hopeless. But as she was about to be put in the ravine, she heard gunfire from a German in the ravine shooting Jews, and she fell and played dead. And it worked. And as corpses piled on top of her all day long, she was able to survive. And at night, she snuck out of the ravine, and when she was sneaking out, she found a little boy who was scared, who was crying for his parents. And she said, "Well, come with me, we'll escape." But as they were running out of the ravine, she heard a gunfire, and she said, Are you okay?" And she heard nothing back, and as she went to see the little boy, he had been shot through the throat, and he was dead. So she got out of the ravine, she got past the German sentries, and she went to a house, and she thought she could hide there, but the woman inside said, "My husband hates the Soviets, and he hates the Soviet Jewry, and he hates everything they stand for. You can't stay here, because when he comes here in the morning, he's going to turn you in." So she was forced to flee, and she survived, amazingly. So to end, I'm going to talk about the remembrance and the aftermath of Babi Yar. In total, over 100,000 Soviet students were killed in or disposed of in the Babi Yar ravine. And you think that the Soviets would want to publicize this and show, how terrible the Germans were, but the Soviet regime had little interest in remembering what happened to the Jews there. In their account of the war, the Jews played little importance in it. It's a really complex thing to explain with the races and how they viewed them, but the Jews did not get their spot in the remembrance of World War II. So after the war, Dina Pronachiva would give multiple testimonies against the Germans. She was at an Einsatzgruppen trial, and she actually got, I believe, 13 of the men hung, and then 2 were sent to hard labor, even though they were just as guilty as the other men. And Anatoly Kuznetsov, who I've mentioned 3 times before already, he actually had to leave the USSR to get his account of Babi Yar published because the Soviet regime kept censoring it, and at one point his book was only 1/4 of what it was. That's how much the Soviet regime censored it. So that's my paper. It's not happy, it's kind of depressing, but yeah.
Okay, well, leave it to the history department to start off the morning on an unrelentingly grim note, but these papers were all very thought-provoking, and I hope they provoke some questions in all of you. And so we now have some time to take questions for each of our 3 panelists. So if you do have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll be happy to call on you. Sure.
For the gentleman that talked on Leningrad, have you been there?
I have not.
Yeah.
You really should go. It was so orderly, the burial, that you would have grave 1A, 1B, 1C, 26A, 27, etc. 2,000 bodies per, like loaves of bread. And there were so many people in these graves that the graves were as much as higher than this ceiling above ground level, because they're digging the holes, laying aside, and then would stack people, Russians, our own people, and then cover it with dirt. Today it's like a park. Well, last time I was there long. I was there in '75, and you could tell that it just went for blocks. It'd be like from Calhoun Street to, out to the edge of the city. And it really does leave an impression if you go to that area methodical. And I'd recommend one book for the students to read. They made a movie on it. It's called The Snipers. How many have ever heard that? It's an old movie or a book, and it was a Russian hero who was a farm kid, and he was in Leningrad, and his entire assignment was to wait days at a time to pick out field marshals and generals and take them out with his sniper rifle. And he became a legend. And he made it through the war finally, and at the very end they got him. But that Leningrad, there was a building there, an old church that's still there and still up, and it's sort of a monument now to the standoff. And parts of that city were, of course, everything was just ripped.
There's also a very interesting museum about the siege that if you go, you should go there too.
The lake saved, they figure, 250,000 people because it froze. That's a bit Lagoda, I believe it's called, and that's where the supplies did get in for some of the people there. And the Germans had some of their crack troops trying to get into the city, and the Russians stood them off with civilians at times.
Alex, is that something in your research? Did you encounter the sort of idea of the remembrance of this siege, or is it like Andrew was talking about, something that it took a long time to kind of come to light?
It took a long time to come to light. The Soviet Union, right after the siege of Leningrad in World War II, was eager to forget about it, and it was not until the 70s and later that they were actually movements to have remembrance like what he's been talking about.
Other questions? Yeah, Shannon.
This is for the iconoclast presentation. I'm just curious, as you were working on that paper, given the current situation in the Middle East, if you saw any parallels between what you were doing in your research and what's happening today in the Middle East in terms of religious conflict and the destruction of icons and such, or were you too busy studying for the paper?
I guess, as in influencing future movements, as in like Islamic movement, is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, like with ISIS or Daesh.
Well, I think we need to remember that with the rise of Islam in the early middle of the 7th century, it came a century and a half before iconoclasm. I think we do need to, so there was that. Well, in fact, actually, you could also say that Islam actually possibly influenced iconoclasm, because as we know, there is a rule, there is a rule that, you can't have like Muhammad or a figure, like if you go into a mosque, there'll be pictures of like vegetation and like words and different stuff, but you can't have an actual like human figure. And there is some say with the advance of the Arabs conquering almost all of the Middle East and stuff, that with their conquest and everything, you have Leo III looking for, as I mentioned earlier, why are we keep on losing military? Well, they look and they're saying, well, what differentiates us from some of our enemies? And looking at the Arabs who keep on winning, they says, well, one of the ones that possibly came out of that was the you can't have humans on like coins or in mosques or something like that. So I guess you could switch that around and say, you could say that Islam did influence iconoclasm.
Thanks.
Hi, question for Alex, Michelle, great papers, all of you guys. You mentioned early on the lack of preparation by the leaders of Leningrad. So I have a sort of two-part question for you. One, if you could talk a little bit more about why the leadership in Leningrad didn't foresee that the siege was going to come, whether you see that as kind of the obstinacy of the leadership itself, or whether it goes all the way to the top to Stalin I mean, I know a bit about Barbarossa itself, and that Stalin just refused to read the signs and see what was coming. And then the sort of speculation question being, if they had been more aware, if they did know what was going to happen, do you think that the siege would have gone differently?
The first part of that question, the reason I believe that they were so obstinate about preparing was actually the man appointed to lead Leningrad during that time was Marshal Voroshilov. He was an old buddy of Stalin's who, during the Russian Civil War, they became best friends at what was going to be named Stalingrad, when they together murdered several of their comrades in cold blood because they were sent to take control of the city. So they had that nice blood-linked friendship. So he wasn't very competent, though, obviously. He believed that the military was better when there were horses everywhere and massive cavalry charges than there were with tanks. So he used that obstinance on that to counteract every military thing he ever could, and he was just a bad general overall. And I believe it's just his general incompetency about the entire war itself that caused the siege of Leningrad to be as bad as it was. And if it could have been prevented, there was another man named, I don't remember his first name, Tukhachevsky. He was kind of the opposite of Voroshilov. He was all about tanks. He thought they should modernize the army as soon as possible. But unfortunately, he went head-to-head with Voroshilov during the Great Purges of 37-38, which saw most of the military personnel, higher leadership in the military, be murdered. And unfortunately, Voroshilov came out ahead and got Tukhachevsky murdered as a suspected terrorist or something like that. But I've read several sources that said they believe if Tukhachevsky had gained control of Leningrad and been in charge, he could have turned around the industry, produced tanks before the war, and quite probably stopped the entire siege from happening.
I think we have time for one more question. Cody, go ahead.
I have a question for Andrew. Yeah. So you talked about how the Soviet Union systematically denied sort of like this history, this really massive part of Jewish history. In the Ukraine after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, has there been sort of like this Babi Yar revisited, or any sort of like revisit of Jewish history after it's separated from the Soviet Union?
Yeah, there's a memorial now to Babi Yar that actually acknowledges the Jewish victims, of the 2-day massacre. Yeah. Also, a lot of anti-Semitism. People like to draw swastikas on the memorial on Hitler's birthday. They've done that 6 times. So, both ways.
And if you could all join me in thanking our presenters once again.